Welcome. My name is Anthony Chow, the Director of the School Information at San Jose State, and welcome to our fourth annual celebration of Native American Heritage Month. The San Jose State School of Information continues to be one of the leaders in educating Native American MLS candidates, and as of last year, we represent 32% of all Native American MLS students nationally. We have a special treat for you today as we're joined by ALA President Cindy Hall and ALA President High School alum Jonna Payton. The high school is honored to sponsor and host today's event. In 1986, Congress passed SJ Resolution 390 to create Native American Indian Heritage Week. And 4 years later, the week-long celebration became a National Heritage Month celebrated in November and was amended in 2008 to also include Alaskan Natives. Please go to our Native American Cultural Heritage area for more information and access to our past 3 symposia. And I'm going to drop that link in the chat. Here. Again, I want to thank all of you for joining us today, especially our special guests and panelists, and especially Cindy Hall, ALA President. So without further ado, I want to hand it over to Jonna, who will moderate today's event. Jonna?
Hi there. Good to see everybody. Thank you for attending today. I'm so excited that you are here with us today. First up will be Cindy Ho, the ALA president. So I believe she is going to be our keynote speaker. And go ahead, Cindy. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hello, thank you for the invitation. I am delighted to be here. I am going to introduce myself in Dakota. Hanmi Takiyapi, Damakota Isantuete, Bede Wakpa, Niobrara, Nebraska. Watakoja, Lyle and Philomene Henry. Wawihake, Robert and Janice Clancy. Waina, Charlotte, Olivia, and Nina, Hihani Washte. I am Cindy Hole. I'm Dakota of the Santee Sioux Nation, and I'm grateful to be here with you. I am the granddaughter of Lyle and Philomene, the youngest daughter of Robert and Janice, and the mother to Charlotte, Olivia, and Nina. And I wished you all a good day. It's so important that as we gather in these spaces that we are able to bring our whole selves to this work across libraries, archives, and museums. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to serve as president of the American Library Association, the largest library association in the world with over 58,000 members across the globe. Well, we have many wonderful stories to share and to celebrate across libraries. It's always important to recognize all groups of librarians, library users, and staff, along with our volunteers and community supporters. As we look at Native American Heritage Month and we continue to uplift the stories of Indigenous peoples all across the world, it is an absolute honor to join you here today to talk a little bit more about how we use Indigenous practices in the field of librarianship. I would like to share my screen with you and we can go through a PowerPoint together. I'm open to questions and I appreciate this opportunity. Thank you, President Jonna Payton of the American Indian Library Association, and of course to our gracious host, Dr. Chow with San Jose State University. So celebrating National Native American Heritage Month in November. Of course, we're Indigenous every day, but it's nice that we have a national recognition as well. So as I shared, I'm Dakota of the Santee Sioux Nation, president of ALA, and also very proud to serve as project manager of the Bridging Knowledge Scholarship, which is sponsored by IMLS. We have 15 amazing students who are obtaining their MLIS degree at San Jose State University. As we move through this presentation today, there are so many things that we could cover. And of course, the time that we have is really what we're able to work with. So as we've taken a holistic approach to librarianship, it's important that we always are able to lean into our culture and to be able to represent in our full identity, while also using our traditional ways of Indigenous practice. As we know, information flows in and out of communities at varying paces, and no two cultures are the same. So it's important when we recognize Native American practices that we are always cognizant of the respect protocols that are in said communities. So whether you work in a tribal community, you are a tribal member working in a non-tribal community, it's important that we're able to be able to represent our traditional ways as information professionals. And we do so by being able to maintain this holistic lens and keep that approach to our work so that as we make decisions as information professionals and leaders, we're always helping people understand that the decisions that we make have an impact on all people. And so as we look to the most vulnerable that we are responsible for in our communities, from our youth to our elders, we are always sharing information in a respectful way and helping everyone see that the diversity among these Native nations is a strength and something that should be acknowledged. So I like to recognize that we are still here. And there are 567 federally recognized tribes, which are sovereign nations within the United States of America. For those of us who hold enrollment in our tribes, we hold dual citizenship as United States citizens as well. And so we have a relationship to our nation as well as the United States of America. There are also states that have received state recognition. And of course, we have millions of lineal descendants all across the United States. I had a clip there from Gathering of Nations powwow, and those are videos that you can find online if you're interested to learn more about a powwow setting and how that is a community event that brings people together. So I always like to talk about terminology and librarianship. And sometimes in the mainstream, you will hear certain terminology that has blended over and there's some confusion around it. And so I want to acknowledge that we show respect to the powwow protocol. We show respect to the people who observe this traditional dance and this community gathering, because that setting is when it is appropriate to discuss a powwow. When you are in a meeting room or in a meeting setting in any institution, sometimes you hear people say casually to one another, "Oh, let's go have a powwow about that." And what their meaning is, let's go discuss that further. And it is not culturally appropriate to misuse the terminology. So that's why I share powwow, so that everyone understands what it is and that we can all gain a better understanding and show respect to one another in the workplace, because it's uncomfortable for everyone when we are in shared spaces and we hear a misuse of the terminology of our culture. So our native ways, we have a lot of ways of knowing, a lot of ways of being. And so, as information professionals, we should be able to observe our practices in these modern times and to be understood in our shared spaces while we are all serving in this profession. So, as information professionals, we are guardians of information, and the tenets of this profession guide us as information professionals to provide accurate information from credible sources. This is meaningful work, and I'm grateful to be called to this work where I can also contribute in a good way. We are entrusted with supporting the public good, and as librarians, we are here to help everyone with their information needs. So as we look at the 3 R's, as we refer to them: relationality, reciprocity, and respect. And Dakota, we say mitakuiwase, and that means that we are all related. And so when we think about that, that helps you lean in towards humanity and to make sure that you are being supportive of everyone who surrounds you, so that we are always working in a good way toward one another. When we say that we're working in a good way, That means that we're going to bring good hearts and sound minds together as we gather, so that as we discuss the needs of the community, we are able to make informed decisions, leaving no one behind. We remain very cognizant with that holistic lens as to what the impacts of the decisions are for the community. And whether it's a challenging discussion or it's a celebration, we always want to make sure that everyone knows that the work of the leaders was intentional and that we were there together in that space, in the shared relationship toward one another, and that indeed the outcome was in a good way for everyone. So we rely on this reciprocity as a basis of respect. In any society, those who wish to share information must do so, not only in a good way, but ensuring that the practice that they hold is going to be for the betterment of society. When we have that reciprocity for one another, we show that the respect we are going to give to one another should be returned, and that we make those decisions so that as library professionals, we will continue to be the trusted professionals that we are. When you look at the annual research, the data shows that over 90% of Americans love their local library and they feel that they have great trust in information professionals. That is such a wonderful position for us to be in. And I'm encouraged by that feedback when we receive that annual data. It's important that each and every day we build respect among each other as colleagues, as well as with the communities that we serve. As long as we are using reciprocity, we will continue to learn and grow from each other while we also strengthen the field. And that creates a very strong narrative for advocacy and support for libraries of all kinds. I always like to share that there are hundreds of tribal libraries in this country, and there are 127,000 libraries in total in the United States. That's public, academic, special school, and tribal libraries. So there are so many ways that we can show respect to our library users and our community members through library service. And that is such a wonderful place for us to be as information professionals. This is why I say there's never been a better time to be a librarian. And I truly mean that, because we are trained to help everyone use information channels and communicate effectively. We do that by helping them identify what is an accurate source and how is this information credible. I think that the work of librarianship is often the heart of the institution, and it should be recognized as that, because we hold deep respect, not only for the written word, but for respectful dialogue in the oral storytelling tradition. And so, as we hold each other accountable to ensuring that we are supporting healthy communities through accurate information, we will continue to rise together. So, there are many traditions that we talk about, and some of them are top of mind, and some of them aren't always as well known. In Native communities, long hair is a strength. It's a story of our people. It grounds us. It reminds us who we are as Indigenous people. It reminds us of our journeys, our lifeways, our paths together. We think about all that we have been through. And as our hair grows and it is our strength, we hold on to that practice and we teach our youth to also understand that these traditional values are with us. And no matter where we go on our journey, we walk with the strength and the power and the wisdom of our ancestors. And that is such a beautiful life to live. I'm very proud to be Dakota. I'm very proud to be a Dakota mother. I know who I am each and every day, and I never forget that I have three littles who look to me for guidance and support, and most of all, love. As library professionals, we have many opportunities each and every day to welcome patrons into our libraries, to participate in story time, to research, to spend time together as a community, sharing this wonderful asset together. As we look to the traditions of Indigenous peoples, there are many traditions in every community, and it's important that all of them are understood, acknowledged, and respected. So when you see professionals wearing their ribbon skirt, or maybe you see them in traditional regalia, it's important to acknowledge that while they may be on their way to ceremony or they're acknowledging an important day in their community, that we do not touch their regalia that without permission. It's the same with anyone's hair. Those are sacred to an individual. And it is never appropriate to go up and to just start asking people about these different ways of our lives without asking for permission. There's also times in our communities when we are experiencing mourning, and those ceremonial practices differ from nation to nation. But again, it's a time for respect, and it's a time to be there and support if they need you to be. But it's also a time to give them the space that they need. So if you see an Indigenous person who has cut their hair, oftentimes that is a signal that they are in mourning and that they should be supported. So as we look at the movement among us, the long hair, the ribbon skirt, those are all traditional ways of knowing about the world around us. And so in librarianship, when we look to what are our current ways of knowing, well, oftentimes it's an alert on a device. Oftentimes it's an email that you receive in an inbox. Sometimes it's still word of mouth, depending on the size of your community. As we look to what's traditional in the term of librarianship, it's important that we remain cognizant of the changes in technology that help us lean into the world around us so that we can have a better understanding of the changes. And as information professionals, it is our connection to each other that we need to remember is always going to be the priority. So as in traditional ways, our connection to the earth is what guides us and grounds us. And as we center in our indigeneity, we always remember who we are as people. We belong to Unchimaka, Mother Earth. We belong to each other. And so as we walk this path together, it's important that we are able to bring our whole selves to this field. As we look to the seasons of change that surround us, that is all traditional knowledge. We know what has happened behind us because those are gifts from our elders who have shared the stories with us so that we can grow and learn together. We use that knowledge as we walk forward as a people, so that in times of weather conditions and other changes, we know which approach is best. It's important in any field to remain cognizant of the traditional knowledge models that exist so that we can always learn from one another and continue to anticipate the future needs. So sharing a little bit of Indigenous knowledge with you today, it's an honor and a privilege to do so. When we have speakers who join us on these panels and they share a little bit of themselves and their community with the greater profession, it's important that we remember that we do so out of respect and that there shouldn't always be an expectation to receive this knowledge. Not everyone has a right to information. And in the information field, I know that that can be challenging to hear because sometimes people feel that everything should be open access. Sometimes people feel that data belongs to everyone. And what we need to remember is that it represents the people. And so you need the permission of the people in order to share their information, to tell their stories. And in librarianship, it's very important that we right the wrongs of the past. And I'm talking specifically about researchers who have made friends with tribal communities, who have observed tribal communities, and then have published information about that community. And you'll often hear people say, well, if it was published, they had permission. But we need to ask ourselves, did they really? When you want to go back on the historical context of this country, did the federal government really have the permission of the original inhabitants? Does an X represent you? Is that your name? Is that your language? Are those your people? As we look to the future. We need to always know what has happened in the past. And that historical depiction is something that we need to hold others accountable to. So while yes, there may be research that exists, it's in a limited format, it's in a limited context. Because just because a scholar interviewed a community member and they conducted research, they were only told what the study wanted to share. So when you look at the broad context, there's of course information that perhaps didn't leave that community because it wasn't meant to. So as we show respect to one another, it's important that even if there's this burning desire to ask an Indigenous community to share about their traditional ways, that sometimes that information doesn't need to leave that community, just like technology doesn't need to share recordings of elders' voices, or chatbots shouldn't lift language and then share it in a new context, in a new channel. Again, I understand that as technology advances and as people want a greater access to all forms of knowledge, we still need to remain cognizant that the traditional practices and what one holds sacred doesn't always translate into other languages or become a part of other communities. And so I share that respectfully. And I do not represent all nations. I'm only Cindy of the Dakota, who's Dakota of the Santee Sioux Nation. I only know how I was raised. I only speak for me and my family. But I share that in a good way because there are times when harm has been done against our communities. And as researchers and scholars and librarians, it's important that we hold ourselves accountable. So this is a fun video for you to look up how wolves change rivers. And there's over, I believe, 1 billion views on it. But this is a prime example of traditional knowledge that has been studied by other scholars and researchers and practitioners who have, created a great film. I believe it's like 5 or 7 minutes. And, these are the things that we've always known as the traditional keepers of these lands, in making sure that we always uphold the relation of our responsibility to each other and all things that are living. The traditional knowledge base of Indigenous peoples has been here since time immemorial. And so as we look to researchers and scholars that come along into our communities and live among us and also observe all life forms, it's important that we remember that there are many different ways and many different lenses to look at the community that surrounds you. And so in this field, it's important for us to think about, what are the wolves right now? Are we able to identify what a wolf is? And are we active in that change? Are we really going to be that change? Because if you watch the video, you'll find out what the change is. And again, that is very relational to Indigenous traditional knowledge systems. It's a restoration, is what it is. It's not a transformation. It was restoring to what it once was. And I think that's a beautiful video, and I hope that you'll take time to look that up. So as I share that there are hundreds of federally recognized tribes and other state recognized tribes, it's important that we talk about what we hold in common. And so our elders are always to be respected. Our elders are always to be acknowledged. In our communities, our elders are absolutely our strength. We look to them in times of change. We look to them for leadership. And so in our communities, you see elders being referred to differently than you do in a scholarly practice. I always want to acknowledge the work of our library practitioners. And Miss McLeod released elder citations. And if you are familiar with her work, please look that up online. But it was really a way of bringing over a traditional practice into a modern context so that everyone could understand that in our community, an elder's word is gold. And so when an elder speaks and an elder shares information and gives you a gift of a story, that is to be commended. And no, the practice is different. The practices that, our elders are the story keepers, they're the culture keepers. And so when they give information, it's to strengthen us and it's to help. So they might, the peer review process is very different in an Indigenous community where people move through their lives together side by side, always remembering who they are as people, remembering who they are as a community. And so we trust our elders to share this information because they have lived many paths ahead of us. And as we recognize that strength, we want to make sure that everyone understands what that looks like outside of our community. So leaning in towards that knowledge, that body of knowledge as a collective and as individuals, everything is based in respect. And as we look at our communities and we acknowledge all of our people, it's important that, of course, we are always recognize all of the life ways, all of the life forms, the animals that are here with us as we all live together on Earth. In this field, especially, we need to look at the wasteful practices that need to be addressed in librarianship and publishing. It's something that we don't often discuss head on because it becomes a byproduct of the materials. But when we have an opportunity to make a change, sometimes someone needs to be the lead wolf and they need to make those decisions for the entire pack. And so as we look to how we can continue to innovate in this field, I do encourage a move towards a digital platform, but we need to remain cognizant that that also leads those behind, especially those in tribal communities that don't have access to broadband internet. So while we have needs to access information in the written form, and we have needs to access it in a virtual setting and through digital channels, we also need to remember that in our community, an elder's voice is the primary source. And so if an elder isn't online and they aren't streaming and it wouldn't be appropriate to record them, then we share information in a different way. And that needs to be acknowledged and accepted. So I mentioned here the United States treaties, and those are the rights to the people. As we look to every administration for their acknowledgement of these treaties, these responsibilities need to be upheld because tribal sovereignty is not negotiable, and that is held in common across all tribal nations. Every tribal nation should be acknowledged in their sovereignty, and statehoods and the federal government need to work together to collaborate and partner so that we are supporting and strengthening all of Indian country. When we say that we are still here, that's a call to action for everyone to understand. It's a time for us to come together and to share information in a good way. And we do that so that we can help all Americans. Those are our constitutional rights. So, of course, in tribal nations, there are many differences as well, and that's worthy to acknowledge. So, our languages are different. Our customs, our regalia, our dances, our songs, our food, our communities, the religious practices, the games we play, the traditional ways of coming into adulthood, of experiencing your first snow, your first laugh. There are so many beautiful traditions that are among us. And it's the strength of that diversity that really helps us as Indigenous people remember what is sacred, and that will always be humanity and supporting each other on our lifeways. So as we look to our words and all of the ways that our lifestyles are defined in our communities, we also remain cognizant that in the mainstream, there's often an interest in Native American ways and lifestyles. And so that's why we share information like we do today. So we can help people understand that a different way of living means that there are many ways of living and that all of them should be respected. So as we look to current issues and hot topics, of course, this lack of acknowledgement of tribal sovereignty and understanding what it means to support those who live and work in Indian country. It's important in this field that everyone understands that if they're working for a tribe and they're supporting their library or archive, that they have a responsibility to the people to curate those collections, to elevate their voices, and to receive the appropriate support to do so. They always need to have approval of the council and the elders before they publish anything outside of the community. And so it's important that as we, as information professionals, curate this information, that we remain cognizant of our responsibility so that we don't bring harm to the community, so that we aren't exposing information that should not leave that community, and that we are always asking for information about best practices regarding research methodology and making sure that this access that we do provide to tribal members is always secured. There are so many layers of tribal sovereignty that need to be upheld. And as we talk about self-determination in this country, we need to remember that the relationship, that trust relationship between the federal government and sovereign nations is one that also includes statehoods. And so as we have elected officials in our state who don't always know how to work with us, we need to educate them on how they can support tribal members and those who access tribal libraries, archives, and museums. Because there is a responsibility we hold to the people that we represent, and there is a shared responsibility with the elected officials who also need to support the tribal community. We also need to talk about state libraries and their responsibility. Until we had the definition of a public library changed, there were many tribal libraries that were left in the dark, with state libraries receiving funding and having the option whether or not they shared that funding with the tribal library. It's always right to include the original inhabitants, no matter what your line of work is. And it's very important that we always show that respect and make sure that we don't leave anyone behind. So a lack of protection of land management is something that is very important to the information field, because we disseminate information and we help people acknowledge accurate resources online. And so if we have reports that are outdated or are limited in scope, sometimes you see communities make decisions about natural resources that perhaps are not for the best of everyone who lives in that community. And so in Dakota, again, we say Minui Choni, and that's water is life. And it's so important that everyone in America has access to potable water. Yet this happens on a regular basis across Indian country, and people don't know that. They don't always know that tribes sometimes have to borrow water resources from other tribes. I see it happen a lot here in the Midwest. And in the year 2024, this isn't something that happens, a long time ago, or this isn't the story of our ancestors. This is today in the present. And so as we talk about issues, everything is information based. It truly is. And so we need to communicate the needs of our communities so that everyone understands how they can continue to uplift and support tribal communities. We have a shared responsibility to the people. And so if there's a lack of jurisdiction, of agency, of voice and representation, we don't see ourselves showing up in the spaces where we should be. Indigenous people should have a seat at the table. Their voices should not be silenced, and we should continue to represent as elected officials. As many of our sovereign nations have their administrative governance bodies, these leaders have been elected to their positions, and they should be respected in the same level of the federal government. We wouldn't just walk up to the White House and demand to speak with the president. And it's important that we build sustainable relationships across Indian country. We do that by building relationships from a point of respect. And so if you're new to working with a tribal community, it's important that you make sure that you're being recognized in the right way, that you're not making demands of the people, and that your expectations are where they need to be. No one has a right to step on Indian land without an invitation. And a lot of people don't know that in the mainstream. Unless there is a business or a place of public information that is open and accessible to everyone in the state, you need to make sure that when you are entering Indian country, you have that invitation and you know where you're going. And then when you make it to tribal headquarters, those administrative offices, you need to know who you're there to meet with. You have that meeting in place and you've shared information about what you're there to do. It's important that as information professionals, we're building sustainable relationships with community service agencies. So oftentimes librarians work with the school, work with the Boys and Girls Club, work with the senior center. And so all the other bodies of commerce as well. So whether you're there for official purposes or you're a guest, please remember that the rules of the land is that of the people. And as a visitor in Indian country, you need to be able to communicate effectively why you're there and who invited you. So I hope that's helpful information. I don't want to scare anyone away. We have many non-tribal members who work in tribal libraries, archives, and museums, but it's important that everyone has that understanding so that we can all share information together in a good way. So of course, we look to our leaders, and there are many Indigenous leaders. These are the two strongest leaders that I continue to look at and support them in their work. And so all across Indian country, there are so many different ways to lead and to serve and to guide. And when we see Indigenous leadership show up in the mainstream, it is so heartwarming to see, because not only do they know the ways of their people as traditional Indigenous people, but they've also learned the ways of the mainstream. And they have their credentials and their experience and their knowledge and ability. And it's such a wonderful time to be able to represent your sovereign nation and to stand up for Indigenous peoples. So in the field of librarianship, there are so many ways that we can continue to do that, to uplift our voices, to help everyone understand how to include Indigenous peoples in your research, and to always ask for information if you're unsure. So I say Piname Wupitatanka. Thank you. I appreciate you. I'm grateful for this opportunity today, and I'm happy to answer any questions as we move along in the webinar. So I'd like to say thank you to Jana, and I will stop sharing my screen now.
Oh, thank you so much, Cindy. I'm so glad to have you here today. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, or you're welcome to, I think you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. In the meantime, while we wait to see if there's any questions, Cindy, why don't you talk about some of the projects you're working on, such as the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples?
Yes, thank you. So in my plan as ALA president, we have initiatives. I work with my advisory council, and we're looking at all the ways that we can serve and share information. And so sometimes innovation comes in the form of just looking at a tool in a different lens. And so, librarians love LibGuides and toolkits. So our first project is our All Nations LibGuide, and we're curating LibGuides from libraries of all types. And on our newly updated ALA website, we have a landing page there, so that LibGuide will live there along with the other tools that are available. And I wanted to specifically talk about an epidemic that's happening across Indian country and across this country, and that is of the missing, murdered Indigenous women and people. And by creating a toolkit, that is a resource that information professionals use on a regular basis. This will be able to help library staff provide access to this toolkit if their community members have a need. It's an epidemic, yet we don't hear about it in the mainstream media that often. And so, we have, as information professionals, we have to ask ourselves, why is that? And so when I see an area of opportunity to improve a situation, that's always what I want to focus on. And so in my role as ALA president, I felt this was a great time for us to be able to bring this toolkit together. And so we're working with other partners, but Carrie Cornelius is university librarian at Haskell Indian Nations University, and she is on my advisory council. And we're working together with some colleagues on curating this toolkit and bringing information together. So I've had a few people ask me, well, what does this have to do with librarianship? And so the first thing I say is, well, it's a matter of health misinformation, because if anyone isn't safe in society, it's a problem. And this isn't impacting just hundreds, this is thousands of people who go missing in this country. And so I also say, if we had thousands of people go missing at the movie theater, we'd close the movie theaters. If we had thousands of people go missing in the grocery store, we'd put a process to getting groceries. You'd have to show your ID at the door. They'd monitor you. They'd make sure that everyone who went in came out, just like at the airport. There are systems and process in place for other things, but there isn't for this very important matter, which is human life. And so we need to identify, are there targets on Indigenous people? And if so, why? Because what we allow is what will continue. And so sometimes you need to be a warrior, and sometimes you need to stand up for the people. And so if we're dealing with misinformation as information professionals, that's a responsibility to right that wrong. When we're looking at data disparity, and that's truly what's happening with the national database, many of the entries don't include our Indigenous peoples who are missing. No one's helping us look for our relatives. Why is that? How come only certain people are being sought after in the mainstream media? It's a good question. And so, as information professionals, if we have a situation happening at the local level, we will have this toolkit that's available that shows searchers how to create a search party, how to contact the media, how to put out a search campaign online, how to use the national database, how to search the registry. And we're also working with Senator Mary Kunish of Minnesota, because she is the first senator in the country to enact a department for MMIWP. So this is a project that's in works. We will be implementing this at the ALA annual conference in Philadelphia in June. And so I look forward to any of your feedback or suggestions. If you want to get involved, please feel free to reach out to me. But thank you for asking for these initiatives. They're near and dear to our hearts, and it's something that's going to hopefully make a meaningful impact on the information field.
Okay, before we go to Gina, we have a comment that says, the writer says, it's a very difficult aspect to discuss for me, but I would like to know if there are any professionals searching the remains of Jane Doe reports. Perhaps there are more MMIW victims that have never been successfully identified, but their remains are found.
Yeah, that's another point. I think the individual families, perhaps if they're aware of that resource, and that's another pathway for their search. It's really bringing that information together so that they can see what resources are available to them. I'm not aware off the top of my head of a project that is moving towards that area, but I think that it would be very helpful, of course.
Oh yeah, I agree. Okay, Gina. Gina was a classmate of mine and a graduate of San Jose State. Go ahead with your question.
Hey, everybody. I actually didn't mean to raise my hand, but thank you so much, Cindy, for all of the work you're doing, and Jonna as well. I really appreciate your presentation today and bringing all of those topics forward. It's awesome to see you both, too.
Thank
All
you,
right.
Gina.
Well, thank you so much. Okay, do we have any other questions? So we have a few minutes. So I have one for you, Cindy. How can libraries best support Native American staff, patrons, and their communities?
Well, that's a great question. I would say that, support all of your staff members equally. It's important that everyone is respected in their wholeness and that library leaders are creating safe spaces where everyone feels welcome in the community and that all staff know that they belong there. We believe that we're here with a purpose and for a reason. And so, as Indigenous peoples, while our ways might be a little bit different, and of course, depending on the nation, we should still be acknowledged for the work that we contribute to the field. Oftentimes, I've been told that I'm too quiet and that there's a misunderstanding about that. But I was raised to understand that the Creator gave me 2 ears and 1 mouth, and that I always need to listen, twice as much as I speak. And so, again, looking at it from a relational protocol, we observe our elders and our leaders in a different way. And so I'm always cognizant of that no matter where I go. And that's something that's a big part of who I am. And, if people seek to misunderstand my quietness and they think that I'm being judgmental or aloof, I've heard both. It's not true, but I know my truth. And so I don't feel that I need to, share that with everyone. But it's important for library leaders to understand that we all have different communication pathways and that we all have a different way that we show up in this work. And so, while I might be quiet, when I do speak, I've noticed that more people listen.
I have to agree with that too. I tend to be that way too. I need the time to process what I hear before I can readily offer an opinion. So I like that, I like to be able to have that time to be able to digest the information I hear, right? So you're part of the Bridging Knowledge scholarship program. So in what ways can we continue increasing the number of Native American librarians?
Well, thank you. So when I joined the field 10 years ago now, I was told, oh, you're a 1%er. And I said, what's that? And they said, well, there's only 1% of Indigenous librarians. And I said, what? That can't be. But then, when I look at the data, yeah, that's what it looked like. So, I was very intentional when I was AILA president to make sure that we were seeing how we could help influence change in this field by recruiting people to go to library school. And so, it was such a wonderful partnership with all of the partners and institutions. And so to see that we're going to have 15 newly minted scholars join our field with their credentials, that's something that's very meaningful to me. And if I don't do anything else, I know that at least we did that in, 2024, 2025.
Exactly. So for you, what is an important aspect of the work that you do in regard to Indigenous practice and ways?
Well, I always want us to be supported in our work. And sometimes if that means to be left alone, then that's what we need to be supported to do. And, I understand that in the mainstream, everything has to be packaged and there has to be a communications plan and everything, should be accessible and published. But that's not how I was raised at all. And so it's hard for me to see myself in this space where we're told that you need to write, you need to share, you need to produce, because we have a different relational model. And so I think that as information professionals lean into their careers and decide what they're going to do with their scholarship, there will always be all kinds of opportunities.
Okay, we have a question from Jonathan. To what degree are you looking at what other countries are doing with the issues of murdered and missing Indigenous women and people and the trauma of residential boarding schools? Is there a transnational approach to these issues that cross these artificial aka political boundaries?
Yes, I appreciate that question. That needs to be my last question. I need to go over to an ALA webinar and then I'll be back. We have an ALA webinar coming up December 20th, where I have Indigenous knowledge scholars from Canada, Australia, and South Africa joining me on a panel where we will touch on that. So I hate to say stay tuned, but please join us on December 20th.
All
So
right.
thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. Thank you so much, Cindy.
Thank you.
Okay, now we will move along to our three presenters. I'm excited to have classmates as well as students from the Bridging Knowledge program join us. So first we will start out with Brandon Castle. He is a recent graduate of the Bridging Knowledge program, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Amakantlach, Amagadisulias Tatachnis Nusum. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brandon Castle, and I'm originally from Ketchikan, Alaska, but right now I'm currently living in Western Massachusetts, where I work at UMass Amherst. But yeah, I'm really excited to be here, and hi to all the San Jose and Bridging Knowledge folks. Yeah, I graduated this past May, so I'm all finished. But still really eager to see the rest of the cohort graduate. And yeah, I mean, enter the field of librarianship. So very exciting time. But I'm really grateful, for this space, and to be able to just hear from folks, other Indigenous folks in the field. Should I go ahead and get started with the presentation, or yeah?
Yes.
Okay. I'll pull that up really quick. Yeah, so yeah, like I was mentioning, I just recently graduated from the program. And the experience of going to SJSU was, I think, a really wonderful opportunity to get more introduced into library science, information science, and also pairing that with Indigenous knowledge. So I really appreciated Cindy's presentation for, just the emphasis on what information really means to Indigenous peoples and how it can help our communities thrive. So that was, I think, a really important perspective that I was really seeking out in the program. But yeah, today I just wanted to share one part of that journey through the program. And so what I'm going to share today is a research project that was born out of a course that was taught by Dr. Julia Gossart, who's a professor in the SJSU MLIS program. And the class is Indigenous cultural institutions and practices of librarianship. So how looking at the intersection of information science and also political structures, but then also how library science can meet the needs of Indigenous communities. So our research project was then we started to do an independent study with Professor Gossart. And yeah, I think it was a really great experience just to be able to dive into what libraries are for Indigenous communities. So our presentation was Spaces of Being, Indigenous Embodiments of the Library. And we were exploring what is a library to Indigenous people? What does this mean for different communities, different cultural needs? So yeah, it was kind of just a background here. It was definitely a sense of passion for this topic, but also looking at how Indigenous library information science professionals, where is the space? How can we continue to expand and develop space for Indigenous philosophies? How can we expand the space for professionals and supporting them and uplifting Indigenous perspectives? How can we utilize the tools of LIS education for Indigenous students and communities as well. And what better way to do that than within the Bridging Knowledge program? I think we were able to really have a lot of solidarity within the program. We were communicating throughout our time in that. Kayal and I, we're really excited to be able to do this, take this class, take the class with Yulia. And yeah, so we've been able to share this a couple different times, and I think most notably was in the International Indigenous Librarians Forum, which takes place, I think every 2 years, maybe it's every year, I'm not too sure, but the space for that was really fantastic, and that was hosted in Honolulu. So it was an incredible opportunity to share our perspectives, and Yulia was a wonderful mentor in helping us prepare the presentation and share out our research. But yeah, what specifically was our research project about? So it was about understanding what the library is for Indigenous people, because we think about textual and physical spaces of the library. So thinking about what you would traditionally see, stacks, books, different media types in a Western library. But there's so much knowledge in our practices, as Cindy was alluding to, and I think that there is so much that information science can do to really better support Indigenous knowledge. So what about instead of just the textual library, what if we started thinking about non-textual practices? So things like dance, something like a basket or a carving. And how would we describe these? And one of the terms that we came to utilize was spaces of being. So what does that mean? Well, just within our independent study, we were able to look at the perspective of what spaces of being is. And so we broke that down into 3 conceptual areas to think about. So places where people go and move about, and places that support their learning and community. So this is where people are interacting and engaging with each other. So really thinking about Indigenous knowledge and the practices that carry that out. So these 3 areas: historical practices, cultural institutions, and communities of practice, and the embodied library were kind of like our guide. So just kind of keeping those 3 red circles in mind. That's what was really helping us integrate Indigenous perspectives more into LIS education. And yeah, just so with this research, we got to dive into some really cool history and looking at how Indigenous knowledge has been classified. So there is a librarian, Ernest Cushing Richardson, who wrote about Indigenous knowledge being more related to ideas and records. And this one was really important, I think, for our just framing, because Indigenous expressions, things like wampum, things like Dakota winter counts, dance, tattoos, all these different things were being considered as the earliest forms of libraries. So the beginning of libraries, things that center around recording things, ideas, memories, and how we as librarians, how we see ourselves in relationship to a library space. So breaking past just the traditional the traditional structures of going into a library space and perhaps checking out a book, but what does the word library mean? So it was a really cool way to look at it, and one of the things that we were able to find is that Indigenous knowledge is really about aiding memory, and we all have a responsibility. So the things that we do as information professionals will have an impact on record keeping and the state of all the things that keep our knowledge system strong. So we carry that responsibility just as our ancestors did. So yeah, we also explored cultural institutions, and Kayal, another cohort member, was really really interested in how to define this. So cultural institutions being systems of established and embedded social rules that structure social interactions, and things like the land, so the very land that we're on. So one of the quotes that Kayao shared that I'll read here is from the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Really awesome book. I believe she just came out with a new book, The Serviceberry, probably like earlier this week. So would highly, highly recommend that. But I'll just read this quote really quick. So, to the settler, land is property, real estate, capital, or natural resources. But to our people, it was everything: identity, the connection to our ancestors, the home of our non-human kinfolk, our pharmacy, our library, the source of all that sustained us. Our lands are where our responsibility to the world was enacted, sacred ground. So, really, really inspiring and really, I think, necessary framing for Indigenous people in this field. So I'll go to the next slide. So just to share a little bit about what Kayao did, I can't do her side of this presentation justice, but just to go over it very briefly is that so she was looking at hula dance as a library. So what if we reframed our thinking and sorry, oops, I just went ahead, but what if we reframed our thinking of how we exchange and share knowledge for future generations? How might we intersect that with libraries and our knowledge sharing practices already? And one perspective that I can share a little bit more in depth is where I come from. So I'm from the Tsimshian Nation, which is in Southeast Alaska, and I looked at how totem poles can be considered a library of a sort, or an archive. And one of the terms that I came across was an archive of the mind. So relying on oral tradition and communities to disseminate that information. So, totem poles, they're references to significant events. They memorialize people. They also can tell stories, and they can also represent family lineage. And you can find totem poles all up and down the Northwest Coast. So, a lot of these pieces of our identity are also our libraries and our archives. I'll go to the next one. So that's just a very short overview of our research, but I think just having this opportunity, being able to take this class at San Jose, I think was a really fantastic opportunity, and I'm really, I think, pleased and really hopeful that this type of class, but also topic can start to carve out its own space in LAS education more broadly. And I think that it was very appreciative to Yulia and everybody for being able to support us through this and just be able to think about this and share this with you all today too. So thank you. And I would, it's kind of a thing that is still being finished, but I think eventually we'll have a way to share this out more in an article from the organization I mentioned, International Indigenous Librarians Forum. They're going to be sharing out a white paper from that conference, and some of our writing will be in there. So that's coming soon. Thank you.
Oh, so awesome. Thank you very much, Brandon. We'll move on. We could put questions if you have any into the chat, and we'll have some time at the end to also do questions. So the next presenter will be Genesis.
Aloha, can you guys hear me good?
Yes.
All right. Aloha nui kako, o no o Genesis Melia Kalave. He kupu au mai ka aina pula o ho'olehua, ma ka moku puni o Moloka'i, ma kia pai aina o Hawaii nei. Aloha, my name is Genesis Kalave, and I am from the homelands of Ho'olehua on the island of Moloka'i, here in the Pai'aina or the archipelago of Hawaii. So aloha. I just want to start off with sending a huge mahalo or thank you to Bridging Knowledge mentoring program, for the opportunity to be a student at SJSU, and continuing to support Indigenous peoples in achieving this degree, becoming information professionals for our communities. So mahalo nui. I'm gonna switch on over to my presentation. All right, so as I've mentioned, I am a student in the School of Information, achieving my master's in library information science. But what really got me back to school was wanting to earn this degree for the Mo'ain Moloka'i digital repository that we are currently working on here. And yeah, so, oh my gosh, it's so hard to know where to start. But first and foremost, I do want to acknowledge our past and current funders for getting this project going, continuing to support us through this. And I'm gonna go to the next slide. All right, so before I go over what Mo'ain Moloka'i really is, I do want to highlight the two entities that really made this project possible. And so Mo'ain Moloka'i Digital Repository was envisioned by two main entities, the Ka'ipumakani Cultural Heritage Center, whose mission is to raise awareness about managing and preserving cultural and natural resources in Hawaii by encouraging community involvement in protecting and restoring cultural sites, landscapes, and materials. And the second entity is the Molokai Library Services Cadre, which is a cadre made up of various librarians and library representatives here on Molokai, in hopes to, I guess, garner more support within that environment, especially considering that we lack a lot of certified librarians on the island. So those that work in the school libraries, in the public library, can really use that sort of support. And their mission is to be a model of collaboration for all types of libraries that will lead to an educational, informational, and culturally literate community. So this partnership became the baseline for continuous archival work on Molokai and has exemplified the Olelo no Eau, Ole hana nui ke alu'ia, no task is too big when done together. So I do want to spend a moment to give a snapshot of the short-lived history of Mo'ain Molokai. And so in partnership of Ka'ipumakani and the Library Services Cadre, they wrote for a grant back in 2021 and received this grant in which they developed a Ho'ili Ho'oilina training program. And this program was to train 3 community members to become interns in learning about digitization, digital preservation, and archival procedures. And this is also when I hopped onto the project as an intern. In this first stage of the program, we visited the various libraries through the cadre and was able to gain hands-on experience in identifying, inventorying, digitizing, and cataloging collections. And within the first year, we're able to digitize between 7,000 to 8,000 records, which was pretty amazing. We spent hours on hours just sitting and digitizing different print materials. In 2022, we continued to digitize and inventory these collections, and we slowly started to work on developing policies around long-term preservation for these now digitized collections that we were able to work with. And in 2023, we mainly focused on building the repository, which we selected Viridian Software, if you folks are familiar, under the DL Consulting, to help ingest the data into databases. And so on our end, that process was mainly preparing the metadata, putting it in a way that could be sent to the Viridian Software folks, where they were able to ingest the data into the database. And after running a couple beta test groups with our repository. We're finally able to establish it earlier this year in February publicly for our community. And so far we have 9 collections representing Molokai institutions, as well as other institutions that include Molokai records. Not sure if you folks are familiar, but here in Hawaii, Oahu is our main island. And that's where we have a lot of our we have our state library, our state archives. And so it's very inaccessible for us here on Molokai. When people want to access archival materials, primary and secondary resources, it can get really hard unless they fly to another island and access it physically. So as we continue our work, we're actively hosting crowdsourcing events to help identify people in photos, and doing live demonstrations of our repository so that we can properly approach this work and make sure that it aligns with our community, because really it's for them. And we also hope that we can eventually establish a physical archive once we get the proper certifications and trainings for that. Okay. So with that being said, Mo'e Molokai is an educational resource made for Molokai by Molokai. It's a fully searchable, centralized repository where you can access archival and general resources that pertain to the culture and history of Molokai, including photographs, newspapers, yearbooks, reports, and a lot more. The mission of Mo'e Molokai is to digitally preserve and promote access to archival materials that lend to the understanding and appreciation of Molokai's rich history and culture. Our goals, some of them include increasing digital access and centralizing that access, encouraging creation of community knowledge, especially in describing the collections, making sure that it aligns with how the community would search it, identifying archival resources on the island, and digitizing and repatriating those materials, especially the ones that aren't on Molokai. We want to bring it to our repository so that it all can be in one place and it's easier for our community to access. The intention of Mo'e, as far as its users or who has access, is primarily to serve and benefit Molokai Kama'aina, which are our residents, individuals that have genealogical ties to the island, researchers that are interested in learning more about the island's history and culture as well. And so far, since we've been able to establish our repository, we received a lot of positive reactions and input. And in all of this, we've come to realize that this repository plays such an important role in reclaiming our Molokai voices over the documentation, the historic documentation of the island's history, and centralizing it so that it can be easier for our community to access. And to tie in our efforts with today's symposium, I do want to echo Cindy's words on relationality, reciprocity, respect. This is what we know as aloha, and we have an opportunity to gain control over the identification, the description, and management of our Molokai records. And as long as we continue to meet the needs of our community here on Molokai, ensuring that this is what they want, we're able to build a future of hope, sovereignty, and resistance to information systems that do not hold space for culture and indigenous people. And that is it for my presentation. So mahalo nui, thank you.
Thank you to you as well. Okay, if you have any questions, please put those in the chat and we can address them. All right, our next presenter will be Susan. Susan was a classmate of mine at San Jose.
Thank you, Yotwa. Ayuki Nanathoim Susan Gare Nakarukwa Arar. And I'm gonna pull up some slides here. Let's see here. Librarianship is my second career. I do a lot of work in language revitalizing. I learned my language as a young adult. I'm also currently I'm working as a librarian at College of the Redwoods, which is up in Eureka, California. And for the next 10 minutes, it is sunny, but we had the bomb cyclone and a lot of rain and flooding. I finished the Circle of Learning program with Jonna. I graduated in December of 2013. And when I started the program, I meant to be learn how to specialize in archives because of my work with language. And in the course of doing some internships, I also found that I really like being at colleges and college librarianship. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Let's see. Next slide. So who I come from, like I said, I'm Karuk and language. I started learning my language as an adult. The picture on the left is it's my dad on the right there, Robert Smith, and then my grandmother, Gladys, who was born and raised where my family is from in Karuk territory, a very small town called Happy Camp, California. My uncle Eldon, who is also Karuk and Wintu as well, and then his wife, Aletha Shoemaker, whose daughter is now the a knowledge bearer of the Hoopa language. And then, so like I said, I didn't know much about my culture until I was a young adult. I moved to Karuk country, and Violet Super, who's the woman in the right-hand picture on the left, and her family kind of took me in, and I started getting to learn the language and started speaking it and collecting language and sharing it with the community, and started having all these library and information questions. And that's how I came to be in library school. Like I said, I was going to create an Indigenous languages archives, and I even wrote my thesis I did an oral history of the Breath of Life program, which revitalizes languages. And but I also got to work in a couple of local college libraries, including College of the Redwoods, which has multiple campuses. I work in the main campus in Eureka, but we also have a branch campus on the Hoopa Reservation. And when I go do instruction there, I see a lot of friends and family. We also have a campus up in Crescent City. And that's the picture with the three windows that have the art in it. It's one of our famous artists, Brian Tripp. And then we also do reference and correspondence instruction for the Pelican Bay Scholars Program. So I feel like one thing I learned from moving home to my tribe, which is very geographically all over the place in Northwestern California, is to remember every place that you work for. So I try not to just, I'm going to take care of just Eureka. I'm going to, my responsibility is to everybody. And so I try and, keep that in mind. So one of the things I get to do as a college librarian is create these terrific research guides and then bring my knowledge of the community to the forefront. So I've got links on this one page about local tribes, links to all of the tribal governments in our region. And one way that this information is like incorporated into practice at the college as a whole is that when I do instruction for forestry and environmental science classes and when they have projects where they need to look at an issue in the region and all the stakeholders, I make sure that all the students know about tribal governments and that they do research and have knowledge in the natural resources issues and how to find and how to incorporate that information. And I took cataloging when I was in the MLIS program. And I get to do some copy cataloging for CR. And one of the things I always wondered about is like why my tribe's name was spelled incorrectly. And I was at and the more important question, how could I change it? Our cataloging system is a product of Ex Libris, and several of us went to the Ex Libris California users group for the, learning how to better use our system. And they had a workshop on diversity and cataloging. And after some opening remarks, they opened it up for questions. And I said, I have a question. I've been a librarian for 6 years, and I don't know how to open the door to like correcting this spelling that has been wrong since an anthropologist misspelled our tribe's name in the late 1800s. And we corrected it in the 1980s, and Library of Congress still has it wrong. And TJ Cow out of UC Davis raised his hand and said, I'd be happy to help you put together a proposal and to correct it. And we worked together. And as soon as he offered and I said yes, I thought, I had better like reach out to my tribal council and ask them if they wanted this done. And they provided a very good letter of support and said, yes, we do in fact want this done. And so then I proceeded and started working with TJ Cow, and we got it done in like 6 months. It was very quick. I've also tried to participate in the discussions about changing the broader subject headings for Indigenous peoples. It's a big question, and I'm glad that lots of people are working on it. One other project, I still get to work with archives, and I've gotten to work with some of our artists. So the Institute for California Community Art and Nature started a project where we wanted to work with late career, elderly, and the families of recently passed California Native artists and help them sort out how they want to be remembered. Do you want to donate your papers to an archive? How do you want your artistic legacy to be cared for? And so with my archives training from San Jose and some previous experience and some internships, got to talk to like families of artists and kind of help them do some preparatory work to help them decide what they want to do and help them, present things in a way that kind of made it easier to work with an archival organization. The man in the picture is Brian Tripp. He was a very well-known Karuk artist, and I got to be his like archival assistant and then process his papers because he wanted them to go to Humboldt State University, now Cal Poly Humboldt. And at the end, we had a big celebration. My last thing I want to talk about, I didn't do this, I can't take any credit for it, but the Wiyot tribe wrote and did staged readings for a play about the significance of cultural fire through theater. And the connection to libraries and information is that the fellow on the right was playing a non-native professor of fire technology, and at one point he says, to this native student who interviewed her aunt about traditional use of fire, and he says to the student, you can't just you just can't cite your auntie. She's not a source of information. And of course the whole audience like boos and stuff. And there was a feedback afterward, and I said, maybe there's all the work that Lorna McLeod our President Hull from ALA also mentioned. In fact, we can cite traditional expertise, and so I think they're going to incorporate that into the play. So I'm just happy to get to do what I do. I feel like I bring what I know to bear, and I'm glad to be part of this group, and I'm going to stop talking here. Thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thank you so much, Susan. I'm like you. I'm just happy to do what I do and glad to do what I do. Okay, I will be the last one to do my presentations. So I live and work in Albuquerque. The Indian Pueblo Cultural Center was built in 1976 and sits on the former campus of the Albuquerque Indian School. The IPCC is owned by the 19 pueblos in New Mexico and one in Texas. The original IPCC building is an open, reversed D shape, which honors the architectural structure of Pueblo Bonito at Chaco Canyon, an ancestral Pueblo site. I've been at the IPCC a total of 22 years. For the last 4 years, I've had the dual role of archivist and librarian. Last Monday, a new dedicated librarian started, which will allow me to focus on being an archivist, which is where my education and training lies. My work at the IPCC has spanned a range of titles and duties as I've worked through my MLIS program. I keep the well-being of Pueblo communities at the center of my work through proper representation and stewardship of materials, by welcoming and being of service to the researchers and respectfully providing answers to questions about the Pueblos. As a student intern, I did tribal library assessments for their readiness for archival work. I've been an archival consultant for the Arthur Beeble Map Project at my home institution, the Sky City Cultural Center and Jaco Museum, and was also a library consultant to the San Felipe Pueblo Community Library. Welcome to our library. We are currently a non-lending special collection focused on the history and contemporary lives of the Pueblo people. We're often asked for first-person historical perspectives, particularly around the time of contact with the Spanish and the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. Our tribal languages are not written, so there are no printed materials from the Pueblo perspective from the time of contact. Our book collection consists primarily of donated materials. However, books purchased for children and youth are primarily Native authored and or illustrated. I wanted to ensure that the natives see correct representations of themselves and their lives in the pages and stories. Our special collections has children's books that were written by non-natives, but illustrated by natives from the 1940s to the 1960s, such as those published by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to use in reservation schools. These are wonderful research materials, but unsuitable for today's children to read. A highlight of our collection is the dissertations and theses authored by Pueblo scholars as well as Pueblo and American Indian topics authored by non-native scholars. We have newspaper articles from the 1970s to mid-2000 on various topics relevant to the Pueblos, from agriculture to education and language to water. We also have biographical but not genealogical files for Pueblos and natives in the arts, as well as materials specific to Pueblos. The archives hold special access and restricted books, which includes topics and photos that are culturally sensitive, as well as older, fragile materials. The archives has a range of materials from scrapbooks of former students and teachers who were at the Albuquerque Indian School, a postcard collection from the late 1930s to the mid-2010s, and we also have maps, posters, and architectural drawings of the campus as it's grown through the decades. We hold manuscript records of Dr. Joe Sando, who was from Walatoa, Pueblo. He was an author and researcher and helped to start the library and archives. We also have records of the Friends of the IPCC. The Friends supported the center through funding, education, docents, and volunteers. Last year, we signed an agreement with the Northern Pueblos Tributaries Water Rights Association to process their records, which centers on the Amit Water Rights Settlement Agreement, which involves various entities, including 4 Northern Pueblos. I'm excited to get work on those records. Whoops, I skipped the slide here. Okay, I spoke about that. Okay, next one. Few visitors, both new and old, realize the center has a library. So I started the Indigenous Connections and Collections blog to highlight the library, but also to counteract invisibility by highlighting Native people, organizations, and culture to show that Indigenous nations across the world still vibrantly exist. I also highlight Native issues and resources and provide links to information and organizations. I assisted on an oral history project that interviewed 20 Pueblo women from 13 of the 19 New Mexico Pueblos. The women talked about their childhood and how they got to where they are now, their education, the importance of mentorships, as well as the disappointments, challenges, and successes they faced along life's journey. Did anyone notice that I was one of this extraordinary group of Pueblo women? I am the past chair or president of the Native American Libraries, a special interest group of the New Mexico Library Association. I hosted monthly Zoom meetings with tribal, Native, and non-Native librarians, vendors, and allies. I wanted people to have a comfortable place to share ideas and to ask questions. I also wrote letters of support for grant funding for various libraries. I am an active member of the Society of Southwest Archivists. It is important to have Native representation in professional organizations. Last year, I was on the Local Arrangements Committee. The conference was held here in Albuquerque, and it was my first time attending. In July, I became president of the American Indian Library Association. ALA is an affiliate of the ALA Library Association. ALA is committed to disseminating accurate information about Native cultures, languages, values, and information needs to the library community. In the past couple of weeks, we've responded to a Houston library reclassification of the nonfiction book Colonization and the Wampanoag Story to fiction, and have asked for better vetting of an Indigenous voice book list from the Sybils Board. Lastly, I am proud to have been a contributor to the Guidelines for Collaboration. The Guidelines was a collaborative process facilitated by the Indian Arts and Research Center at the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe. These guidelines were developed over a 3-year period between more than 60 Native and non-Native museum professionals, cultural leaders, artists, and scholars experienced in collaborative work in various institutions across the US, Canada, and New Zealand. These are practical guides for building successful collaborations and positive relationships between tribal communities, museums, and other collecting institutions. Though the focus of the two documents is on a collections-based collaborations, the guidelines can apply to all types of collaborative work in museums, libraries, and archives, including education, exhibits, and public programs. I have other projects in the process of collaboration, as well as been a keynote speaker for best collaborative practices. So here's my contact information. Thank you so much. Okay, so now we will move on to our panel discussion with Susan, Brandon, and Gina. I'm sorry, Genesis. I just saw Gina's name on the screen here. Okay. Okay, so we have some questions. Dr. Chow had a couple, so I will start with those. How can libraries best support Native American staff, patrons, and their communities? And Susan, we can start with you.
Let's see here. I think one way that libraries can support communities is through things that are just going to sound like being a good library, but good collection practices. Collect, diverse materials. Collect materials by us that reflect the community that you're in. Approach. Know that information seeking happens in a variety of ways. One thing that I've learned about my culture is that direct questions are not always the way. And I can remember a few like getting chewed out for you ask too many questions by some elders, and that one way people learn is through observation. And so like be in the community to be observed and to and observe and yeah, participation is key. Those are my first thoughts. I'll let other folks speak to it.
Okay, Brandon, how about you?
Yeah, no, I definitely like Susan, think of ways that, maybe the information seeking can look a lot different. There's different needs, and I think, definitely just building relationships with community members, creating opportunities to be in library spaces to where it doesn't maybe feel like intimidating, or that there is a place for the community within a library. So my answer, while there's so much, I would say one is space in the library, to have community events or different cultural practices. Just making the library a space, and not just library, but archive, museum, places where people feel like they can go and further build community, I would say.
And Genesis.
Yeah, so I actually am a part-time library assistant at our public library. So that's where I can actually see the librarianship side kind of come into information profession. And what I found really helpful as far as reaching Indigenous communities or diverse populations is definitely engaging with those communities, being very open to having people from those communities come into the library and do programming, workshops, events. And like, for example, the public library has an event that honors the different ali'i or monarchs from our Hawaiian Kingdom era, celebrating their birthdays, talking about what they've done in our history and why they're so important. And that's been bringing in a lot of our Native Hawaiian community to the library. So what I've also found important is the leadership aspect of the institutions that we work in. Because we have a branch manager that is Native Hawaiian and that is local to Molokai now, we've definitely seen an uptick in locals coming into the library because for the most part, it's a lot of tourists that comes in interested in learning about our island and whatnot. So that's been a blessing.
Mhm. Okay, thank you for your answers. The next question. What role do libraries play in assisting with the digital preservation of Native culture, language, and materials? We'll start with you, Brandon.
Can you just say that one more time? Because I want to.
Sure.
It's a great question. I want to be able to think about it.
Okay. What role do libraries play in assisting with the digital preservation of Native culture, language, and materials?
I mean, yeah, like I think creating awareness of those collections, digital collections, and making sure that those collections are accessible in a variety of ways. So um, sometimes digital files and different digital repositories takes Wi-Fi to to download things. It takes bandwidth. So I think just keeping that in mind, just creating a sense of awareness, I think is really important. That's what I've seen a lot in my work that I've been able to do so far, and even a little bit at SJSU is yeah, just thinking about how to make communities aware of collections, whether that's direct outreach, programming, just kind of folding in specific collections to highlight into all different aspects of library work. And yeah, one of the things that I was involved in was, trying to create a map of those types of materials. So that was at the Amherst College collection of Native American literature. And yeah, we were like, how can we create an actual, digital map where people can see where Native authored books are published? So, and the whole, I think the core of that was how can we make greater awareness of collections?
Mhm. Okay, Genesis. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm all for what Brandon is saying. I also want to add that using social media has been a really big tool for pushing out what we have available in our collections. Yeah, and well, I don't know what else I was going to say about that, but you have to know your communities, I guess, too, and what their needs are as far as information so that you know what you can help them find and make accessible. Because I feel like the archives specifically kind of has a traditional idea where people think that it's impossible to get documentations and historical records, but our responsibility as those information professionals is pushing out what we have. So using social media as a tool has been really helpful.
Okay, Susan.
One thing I think of is good cataloging practices, and if the catalogers don't know how to catalog something in language that with respect and with respecting their professionalism, reaching out to language communities for better cataloging. And what else? I think of like the Advocates for Indigenous California Language Survival and their Breath of Life Archives Institute is welcoming people in, providing the expertise to not only like find the materials, but also like bringing linguists in to help provide training and like, how to interpret the materials, and then encouraging like the creation of new information. That program, which is, started by Native people, got participants thinking about like feeling more welcome in educational institutions, and realizing that they had bodies of knowledge that needed the same enduring care and preservation. Yeah.
Could I
That kind of leads, go
could I
ahead.
just one thing to kind of what Susan is saying, it's important that we bring the profession into our communities and, make people within those communities a part of the work that we do. I think that's might be easier than trying to find ways that we can change the system. Rather, we become those representatives, and push more for Indigenous approaches within the information profession. I've seen that to be probably the most successful thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's one thing I'm always asking for is collaborations with tribes, pueblos, what have you, nations, communities, tribal communities. So on that note, my question was, so Native language is important to Native culture and identity. So how does the Native language work how is Native language in your work? And you've kind of touched on that, Susan, but I'll let you speak first.
Let's see here. It's what got me to information in the first place, and I thought for a while I focused on being a librarian. Sometimes the politics gets very hard. But it's information that the communities definitely want to hang on to. And so even though it's difficult, something in one of Brian Tripp's poems is, "What I know is what I owe." And I'm like, okay, I can do this. I'm coming back. I'll do what I can. I'm a grown up. I can have difficult conversations. And I've kind of forgotten the original questions, but yeah, language is an integral part of our information system, and it's something that we need to keep accessible for communities.
Mhm. So for Brandon and Genesis, what is the significance of language in your work?
I can go first, Brandon. I think you were waiting for me. Yeah. So since I've started this archiving initiative back in for a few years, I haven't been in this field for a long time, but what I'm realizing is that in Hawaii, we have had a lot of revitalization of Olelo Hawaii or Hawaiian language within the archive field, specifically like within collection development, controlled vocabularies. There's a huge initiative that I could share here on chat. It's called Kawaiha Pai, but it was a project that's been happening for a few years in trying to bring together people from the archive field and museum field to figure out Olelo Hawaii controlled vocabularies, and figuring out ontologies of Hawaiian knowledge domains so that we can better organize our information. So I think that's mainly what's been happening as far as infusing language within the work that we do. And I'll share the website of that particular project.
Okay, Brandon.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think I guess the way that, language, at least so far that I've seen pop up in, this field is definitely related to integrating other ways of knowing and, being as respectful as possible. I think it's a lot of cultural sensitivity and reparations in terms of the library world. Like Susan, your example is the catalog records reminds me a lot of some of the work that I've seen in terms of correcting terms. It's like how do these people that are being described, how do they actually define and see themselves? Like let's ask them directly. I think that's it really speaks a lot to how people the different ways that of knowing that I think we really need to pay attention to in libraries. Like how can we better integrate that? How can we better respect that? So I think, like I've seen small interventions, I think, here and there, whether it's making a term more accurate, or especially like in a museum setting where you have multiple different types of, more tangible cultural expressions. It's like, how can you integrate indigenous terms so that when community members do come into certain spaces, especially, maybe non-indigenous institutions, how can they see their own knowledge represented and build that sense of trust with these different repositories that do steward these collections. So just to say that I think that language is probably one of the biggest pieces for a lot of this type of work, is that's a way of knowing for us. And I think it's very important that that's respected and there's plenty of space for it.
Mhm. Yes, agreed. So on that note about trust, I asked how to build relationships with tribal communities, and trust is definitely one of the bottom, um, the main one of the main things that we need to do. So how would you what is a good way for people that want to work with you or want to help you in the work you do? How can you build trust together? What is the best approach for building a collaboration together with you? Okay, and I'll start with Brandon.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so essential, and I've seen there's a lot of like really good intention, and I think initiatives that are put out there to do that type of work, to build relationships with local communities. And there's so much that goes into it, reconciling with with the histories. But I'd say, like, given where certain institutions are at, just really knowing like where the relationships already exist or how they can be nurtured even further. I think as individuals, showing up to local events, making yourself familiar, knowing that you're engaged and supportive, I think probably goes a long way. And I would say that once that is once your presence is acknowledged, and I would say that to me kind of opens the door, organic flow to understanding the needs of a community and understanding where our individual roles can really help support meeting the needs of communities. So there's so much more that goes into it, but I think that's just one thought there.
Okay, thank you. Susan.
Yes. So some things I thought of is like start with building good relationships um, before you want to do a collaboration. I like the idea of going to local events, or like when you read the local newspapers, see, pay attention when there's something about the local tribal communities, or read their websites, things that don't put a burden on individuals. It's like the resources are already there. and start early. Um, do the opposite of, like I'll just say one thing that kind of ties into language real quick is that it can take, like, if I get a lot of requests for translation projects, and so those take time, and so it can take weeks just to find somebody who can translate a particular thing. And then their work takes time, and so it's not something that can be done in a week or 10 days. It takes time and relationship and understanding. So, yeah.
Yeah, I support what you guys are saying about being out with the community. That's kind of my ultimate answer. It's really important to just start those conversations, share about your work that you're doing, and seeing if there is a way that you can meet the needs of those communities. Here on Molokai, because we're such a small island with barely 10,000 people total, it's pretty easy to identify the communities and reach out to those communities. And the idea of people as resources, right, is really significant, I feel, in almost any profession. Sometimes it's not about what you know, but who you know, and making sure you're establishing those relationships and continuing to maintain those relationships. Yeah.
And I think one thing I always emphasize is when you're going to work with the community, it's the community who dictates how the work goes, what's to be done, how it's to be done, and so on. Okay, so what ways do you think we can continue increasing the number of Native librarians? Anyone? Okay.
Round 3 of a cohort of Native librarians. And then us that have been through the first 2 cohorts to encourage folks in our communities that have a information sharing orientation.
I'd agree. I think with us, the Circle of Learning, it was so great to have a cohort together, especially because students come from all across the US. And in some ways, we became the teacher in classes because a lot of them didn't understand things like, how tribal communities don't necessarily have internet access, broadband access. And that was a surprise to others. So, yeah. Okay, Brandon.
Yeah, I would say more Native faculty, more classes that focus on Indigenous topics. And then, one other thing is I would say, yeah, giving Native students jobs while they complete their MLAS fellowships, so that they don't have to worry about financial struggles, and continue to develop their practice and get that experience.
Great. Yeah, great suggestion. Okay. Genesis?
Yeah, in a small community mindset, for me, it's really just visiting the schools, being out there in the schools, sharing about the profession to the students, whether it's elementary, middle school, high school. I think that's where you can really start to infuse it into their minds, like, wow, this is something that is going to benefit my community, my culture and language. And also continuing to push for financial support to have that for people to be able to attend school and get the degrees and certifications is super important. And that's something that is probably the hugest struggle, is the financial component. So grateful for Bridging Knowledge for giving me this opportunity to be able to get the degree. Very, very grateful.
Yes, exactly. I never thought I'd get a master's or attempt a master's. And there was a point I was going to make, and now I've just forgot about what you said. Maybe it'll come to me. Okay, so we have a question from the audience. How would you encourage Indigenous librarians that are not working in an Indigenous institution It can be lonely and exhausting representing as a 1% librarian, but also critical. Who would like to start with that, an answer for that, or a suggestion for that?
I'll go. I I think one thing that helps is having found, or it turns out my library is a good team. I'm the one Indigenous California person in the library, but the team around me has a big commitment to diversity, and so yeah, I'm happy to be part of a good team. And if they're not the good team, then find the good team somewhere. Pace yourself. It's lifelong work, and like I don't try to get on every committee that has something to do with multicultural and diversity. I work on the projects that I want to, and then I figure that I'm going to bring that to anything that I work on. So, yeah, that's how I think about it.
For me, that's a difficult question to answer, but I think what is important is finding your support system, whether that's your friends, your family, coworkers. You have to find that in order for you to be able to get through it and believe in yourself and the work that you do, because it's so important regardless of the challenges. So yeah, best of luck in that. Whoever put that question in, there is a support system somewhere for you, for sure.
Yeah, I think support system is really important. You know, professional organizations like ALA, ATALM, Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, Museums. You know, I don't know if there's a name for the question, but if that person feels comfortable, if you want to send me an email, bcastle@umass.edu. I know that there's been some intentions to form like an Indigenous Studies support network, so that might be something worth looking into. But yeah, I would say it's not all on you, and I would say, like Susan, you know, yeah, I mean it's other people's responsibilities to learn and educate. So yeah, I think just you know, also protecting your own interests and how you feel about things is really important, for sure.
Okay, and this is kind of a related question. Do you have any advice for someone currently in library school? What keeps me grounded sometimes is my community, but it is difficult being in a PWI and in a mostly white program. So it would be great for San Jose to have every college, I think, that has a library program to have some sort of native cohort. And I'm not sure, that's an anonymous question, so I'm not sure what school they're at, but I'm sure there's also like native studies where you can find people, and any American Indian groups on campus. Anyone else have any suggestions?
Something that helped me get through was like from the very first class, any assignment that I was given, I answered the question in relationship to the communities that I was working with and to my own community and my own information needs. So kind of kept my eyes on where I wanted to be, and yeah, that was one thing that helped me a lot. I was appreciative of the remote learning so I could stay in my community.
Mhm.
Yeah, I like what you said, Susan. I'm in that same boat. Personally for me, I when I have those times of struggle, I just go back to like the beginning, as in looking at historical records of resistance that our culture or our communities had to go through, in order to be at this point in the information profession, thinking about your ancestors and the history that went on. And so being grateful that we made it to this point, I guess, in history. Yeah, and always falling to the communities that you serve, because they'll definitely give you that push, to keep going, especially when you find those little moments where you helped someone connect to a record that brought a lot of like genealogical ties, or like they're able to find their ancestors within your records. I think moments like that really helps to keep the ball rolling. Yeah.
Oh, that's a great answer. Yes. Finding that connection through records. I love when I help somebody connect to the information that they're seeking, and it's like, yeah. Anyway, Brandon.
Yeah, I mean, like I would say that it just, I think in a similar vein of what you were saying, Genesis, is like, yeah, like we're at this point, and I think that our voices and your voice, like they're so vital for these programs and beyond just school. I think it can feel like a lot of pressure, kind of pushing against the system or the institution. I would just say, yeah, like you have, so much, you have such a valuable perspective, and we all do as Indigenous people in these types of settings, that, that people want to hear, that is so important to, being able to change this field. But, again, it can feel like so much pressure. So I think one other piece of advice is, also just to take care of yourself, and, remind yourself that it's like you have a voice that is really impactful. So, don't let these, perspectives that, oh, this doesn't fit in, it does. And it's really important that we're all here.
Yeah, I've always appreciated those instructors at San Jose who, I wouldn't say allowed me to do work from my tribal perspective, but I was able to put in projects that I was working on here at the Cultural Center and use those for assignments. And so that always helped me know that I was on the right path, and that this was what I wanted to do, and that I could make a difference. Okay, so we have a question that was in chat. Let's see. Caitlin says that I struggle in my library classes to have critical discussion around access, because I believe communities should have complete control over any information about them, including restricted access. How did I go about having these discussions in class in a better way? So anyone, if you want to take that question on.
I'll tell you what I'm thinking, but I don't have an answer, but so much like I kind of had the same struggles. So like, yeah, not everything in my community's knowledge does everybody know. And I think just putting it on the table and letting it be there, because people need soak time, and people who are used to getting like feeling like access to like information should be 100% free, no qualifications. It is a trip for them to realize that is not the case in the entire world. And so just putting it out there, letting people might need a day, a week, 6 months to soak it in, but know that you might get heard.
Mhm. Anyone else have any thoughts? That's a question I think that it's gonna take some thought. I would want to have, I think, a little more information so I can help with this. But when I talk about restricted access, people do get surprised. I had a Pakistani group that came to visit, and I mentioned the special access and restricted, and one of the gals was like, "Oh, but we are proud of our culture. We share everything." And I said, "Well, we're proud of our culture too, but feel we don't share everything. There's things that are kept within the tribal community." And I just had to explain what restricted meant to us. And of course, that's going to be different for every indigenous culture across the world. And even it's hard for me when I'm doing when I receive books, because we get a lot of uh, donated books, and I just kind of assume whatever's sacred for me is likely sacred for everybody else. And so if I see any, and I try not to look hard because I know sometimes I'm not even supposed to see certain images as a female and as someone not from a particular tribe. But if I see anything, if the title says religious, it's already okay, that's either special access or restricted. If I see any images of what I feel are masks or sacred regalia, that's automatically, special access or restricted. So it just takes, I think, a lot of learning, even on our part, to know, because I don't know 100% what, I'm not allowed to see. I just assume what I'm not allowed to see, I guess is the way to say it. Okay, so Diane has her hand raised. Let's see if I can. Okay, go ahead, Diane.
Hello, everyone. My name is Diane Curtis. I am an MLA student at San Jose State, and I actually have something here to contribute to Caitlin's question. I also hold a Master of Theological Studies from Emory University Candler School of Theology, and I spent a lot of time lecturing in expressions of sacred traditions and ceremony. And I have had this question posed to me several times. I am actually working on a project on digital sovereignty and indigenous librarianship. And I live in the North Georgia mountains on Cherokee land. And I've had a lot of people here locally push back against this concept. And I have reached back into my past as a lecturer in theological studies to frame this argument in ways that are familiar to the person that I'm in conversation with, who is also the person pushing back against these concepts is also non-native. So framing these in Western traditions that they understand has been incredibly helpful. So I ask them, would you, as a non-Jewish person, walk into a synagogue and start putting your hands all over a Torah scroll? Would you, as a non-Catholic person, walk down the aisle of a church, go behind the altar to the sacristy, and start consuming the Eucharist? No, you would not. And those two things, those seem to be light bulb moments when you place it in that context of things that they're familiar with, that they understand culturally, socially, that this is ridiculous and offensive, that it's just one more step to discuss indigenous materials, especially things that are culturally sensitive, that are sacred, that are meant to be secret. That seems to hit for them. They're able to then put those two together to realize that these are different, very different traditions, but it's a similar concept and it's a similar way of treating these materials and treating the people who should be the ones to determine who has access and who doesn't. And also just, a lot of people, oh, well, that's just gatekeeping, to which I say, yes, it is. And they're entitled to do that.
Thank you. That is a great answer and a good way to relate it to. Yes. Okay, so we are coming up toward the end of the well, hour and a half, I guess, 2.5 hours. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments they'd like to say? I would like to thank San Jose State for allowing us to have this symposium. And I'd like to thank all of you, Susan, Genesis, and Brandon, for being on here. I wanted to highlight the work of those of us that have gone to San Jose State. So I'm so thankful that you all made the time to be here today. And I'll leave the closing comments to Dr. Chow.
Yes, I want to thank all of you for taking the time. Let's all give them a loud virtual round of applause. I don't know what to say, but for their time and their wisdom. I want to thank Jonna in particular for her leadership in organizing, coordinating this. Part of our goal of the symposia is to record them and to share the full transcripts. So please be on the lookout for that on our website. I also want to thank all of the people that behind the scenes. So our students, Matsuko Friedland, Nicole Azoff, our director of marketing, Nicole Purviance, our events coordinator, Vivian Zuo, and most definitely our tech team, Fredo Alcantar, Bethany Winslow, Samantha, and now Heather. Without you guys, we wouldn't be able to do all of this. Our next symposium will be Black History Month in February, and again, visit our Native American Resource Center that has all of the past 3 years worth of symposia, as well as full transcripts. So again, thank you so much for joining us, and Jonna and Brandon and all of our panelists. Thank you again for sharing your time with us. So have a great day. And team, if you could hold on just for a second, we have to have our proverbial photo that we can share on social media. So thank you.